Mark Bittman for Edible Education 101, and I'm here with Jose Oliva from Food Chain Workers Alliance. Hi, Jose.
Hi, Mark.
Before we get into your work specifically, let's talk about workers in the food chain in the United States, what that means, who they are, and what the issues are.
Sure. Well, there's roughly 20 million people that work in the food system in the United States in what we have identified as 5 distinct sectors in the food system. So there's food production, which is farm workers, sometimes folks who work inside of farm production facilities.
Canners and whatnot.
Precisely. And then those folks ship the food somewhere. So there's that second sector, which is logistics. Those are folks who predominantly work in the transportation industry. And then there's food production, food processing. That's mostly meat and poultry processing workers. And then it sort of splits into 2, right? There's grocery store workers and then restaurant workers on the other hand. But it's basically the retail end, right? So from production all the way to retail, roughly 20 million people.
That's a tenth of the workforce, isn't it, roughly?
Yeah, it's the largest private sector employer in the United States. And, you know, what I was going to say is that, ironically, food workers are the most likely to be food insecure. Because the wages in the food sector are amongst the lowest wages in the private sector in general, right? 8 of the 10 lowest paying jobs are in the food system. Restaurant cashier, restaurant workers in general at the lowest, and farm workers the second lowest. And then the other 8 are all in the food system. So it's a fairly, it is the bottom lowest paying jobs. And in terms of benefits, we are talking about almost non-existing benefits, right? And the food service sector, for instance, where there's roughly 13 million workers, about 80% of them have no health insurance. Even with Obamacare, most restaurants have figured a way either, you know, to slip through the cracks of Obamacare, or to just pay the fee, pay the fine, and not insure people.
They slip through the cracks by having workers work part-time or off the books. 13 million of those 20 million are
food service.
Food service,
That's
which
right.
means restaurant workers? Restaurant, cafeteria,
That's correct.
hospital food services, prison, school, et cetera, et cetera.
That's right. It's institutional food service as well as the private sector restaurants, you know, that you and I know very well. The restaurant industry itself is actually broken up into 3 distinct subsectors, right? There are the fast food restaurants that have no tipped service, no service to the tables in general. And then there's the sort of family-style restaurants in the middle of the industry. Some of them have okay wages, but the vast majority of those places are places like IHOP or Denny's, right? So
tipped workers who are being paid
the sub-minimum wage, right? And the federal minimum wage continues to be $2.13 an hour. Which is lower in states that don't have their own minimum wage. So there's 23 states in the United States that don't have their own minimum wage, and in those states, the federal tip minimum wage is $2.13 an hour. So you can imagine being a midnight shift worker at IHOP and getting maybe 2 tables that come in. And you're making $2.13 an hour.
And you could work a whole shift for $20.
Correct. Yeah. So that's largely why there's a lot of food insecurity in the food system.
I don't want to belabor the obvious, but I do want to say, I just want to run through where those of us who are not in that industry encounter people who are in that industry, because we have daily encounters with people in the food service, no matter where we are. We have daily encounters with those kinds of people.
Absolutely. You know, according to the National Restaurant Association, about 50% of Americans have worked or will work in the restaurant industry, which means, that's half. That's half the U.S. population, right? And so, obviously not half of the U.S. population is currently working in the restaurant industry, but it means that we all have some level of familiarity with it. And that is both a blessing and a curse, right? Because on the one hand, you can empathize with folks who work in the restaurant industry. On the other hand, a lot of folks that sort of pass through the industry put those folks who are in the industry because they have no other choice in their shoes, and essentially blame them for being poor or for being stuck in the cycle of poverty. Where in fact, a lot of these folks don't have a choice. This is a job. In my case, for instance, we came here from Guatemala in 1985. My mom was a school teacher in Guatemala. She was a professional. The only job she could get when we came was a restaurant job. Because we came without status, when I graduated high school and wanted to go to college, my first job, my way of paying my credit hours was by working in the restaurant industry. And so there's a lot of folks like that, not just immigrants, but a lot of folks who literally have no choice but to work, not just in the restaurant industry, but in the food system as a whole, right?
I don't think it's unfair to say that the general impression of farm workers is that they are immigrants, sometimes documented, sometimes undocumented. Is that still pretty much accurate?
Yeah, it's pretty accurate. It's in the 80 to 90 percentile undocumented. The food production industry actually depends heavily on two types of immigrant workers: undocumented workers and H2A and H2B workers, who are basically guest workers that are brought in, recruited, in their hometowns in Mexico and Guatemala and El Salvador, and then brought to work for a season in the U.S. and then sent back at the end of the season. Obviously, many of those workers don't go back. They stay without status and then are employed either by that same farm the next season or by a different farm. The entire migrant worker chain depends on workers overstaying their visas, or coming without inspection across the border, and then getting jobs in farms, and then working sort of the seasonal jobs all the way up north in the summer, and then back down south in the winter.
And what are wages like for farm workers now? What are the federal guidelines on that?
Well, unfortunately, farm workers are exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act. So there's two stories here, right? There's a story of farm workers and restaurant workers, for that matter, being excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act and the National Labor Relations Act as a deal that was cut when both of those pieces of legislation were passed in the 1930s with Southern Democrats. Because Southern Democrats were being heavily lobbied by folks who depended on labor that essentially used to be slave labor.
Right, the 30s were not that far removed from...
Right. And so they wanted to continue to exploit that labor, that workforce, in the same manner that they were used to exploiting it when it was when it was slaves. And so they lobbied heavily, the Southern Democrats, to actually cut a deal that would exclude farm workers, restaurant workers, other professions that were originally held by slaves. The story that farm workers are, that it's a family business, it's mom and pop, and 16-year-old Timmy that goes out and gets the hay or whatever. And this is sort of this narrative that plays in our collective imagination about what happens in the farm, which of course is not how the agribusiness works these days. But that's the narrative that's been fed to us, that we believe, right? That we think, oh, okay, it's okay to not have a minimum wage for farm workers because farm workers essentially are the family, right? That small family in the Midwest that's doing corn and wheat, right? But that's actually not the case
And it
anymore.
never was the case, actually.
Yeah.
Although there might have been some Timmys working on some farms, but
Right.
more likely Manuel and Manuela.
Right. Right. And increasingly, what we've seen is, all of the jobs that used to be held by slaves, held by now immigrant workers, transitioning from immigrant workers to migrant workers, and in an attempt to legalize essentially that exploitation once again, right? To create sort of a systematic way of codifying that exploitation that exists now.
Well, there have been some times, I don't want to go too deeply into this, but there have been some times where the guest worker thing was really codified. And now it's much muddier, it seems. It's,
Right.
as you say, overstaying your visa or coming across the border without
Right.
skipping the border check, or and yet, no matter how this workforce gets to the fields, it's almost entirely non-white. It's almost entirely immigrants or migrants. It's almost entirely Spanish-speaking.
Right. In some cases, there are still some Filipino and Asian workers in the fields, but I think largely you're right. I think it's predominantly Mexican, Guatemalan. A lot of the Guatemalan workers, for instance, in Immokalee, Florida, Coalition of Immokalee Workers is an organization of tomato pickers that helped create the Food Chain Workers Alliance. And a lot of their members are Guatemalan Mayan immigrants whose first language is not Spanish, right? They came here in the 1980s the same way my family did, some of them later. And in a lot of cases, those folks came from rural parts of Guatemala. They were subsistence farmers in Guatemala, came here and found themselves working in the fields of Immokalee. Their first languages are Mam or Cachiquel or Quiche, one of the many Mayan languages spoken in Guatemala. But these are folks that all of the conditions lend themselves for exploitation because they're in many cases unable to communicate with the Mexican workers who only speak Spanish. So innovations like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, the reason they call themselves a coalition is because it is a coalition of Haitian, Mexican, and Guatemalan workers, right? And all three speaking different languages, but pretty different cultures, et cetera, coming together to demand better working conditions.
Well, let's use that as a bit of a jumping off point to talk about what efforts are being made and how things might start to look better for these 20 million food service workers, food system workers, sorry.
Yeah, there's, so we've been working for about 6 years now, building this coalition, Food Chain Workers Alliance. When we started the coalition 6 years ago, we started to notice that there was a growing interest on the part of consumers on food. In the restaurant industry, members of the restaurant opportunity centers would come in to report to us that someone came into their restaurant today and demanded to know where this chicken was raised or is this produce organic. And that was really the tip of the iceberg, right? We started to notice that, and simultaneous to us noticing it, Coalition of Immokalee Workers was noticing it, CATA was noticing it, Brand Workers was noticing it. So there were several organizations that represent food workers across the entire spectrum that were also noticing this this shift, right, in consciousness in the American consumer. What was missing was there weren't a whole lot of people coming into that restaurant asking, are the workers growing this being paid a living wage, or are you being paid a living wage, restaurant worker? And so because of that, we decided to form this coalition that we're calling the Food Chain Workers Alliance. The coalition currently has 24 member organizations We represent roughly 300,000 workers in all 5 of those sectors that I mentioned earlier. And the goal from the get-go was twofold, right? On the one hand, it was let's make sure that we insert workers' voices into the ongoing discourse around food, so that it's not just about health and environment and agriculture and access, but it's also about labor.
Right.
And secondly, let's figure out how we can actually create a campaign that is intersectional, that brings together the sectors of the food movement for food system change, right? Because we noticed that one group, it was like the case of the balloon, right? When you squeeze one side of the balloon, the other side blows up. When groups were demanding an end to the use of routine antibiotics in poultry, companies simply shifted the cost and went to either a non-union producer, and then labor paid the price, or a producer abroad, and then we just didn't even know, right, where the chicken was coming from. So we knew from the beginning that if we were going to tackle food system issues, we couldn't go at it piecemeal. We couldn't go at it one issue at a time. As much as our organizing instinct told us that issue organizing was the most effective, that this had to be systemic, that we had to address all of the sectors at once in order for us to get at a solution that really made the food system work for all of us, instead of just for the few corporations that were benefiting from commodity agriculture. So with that in mind, we started to convene meetings with organizations across the food system that were working around health issues or environmental issues or agriculture focused on food. In the course of doing that, we ran into a couple of other folks, Aneem Steele and Navina Khanna, who were doing the same thing. And so instead of reinventing the wheel or competing with them, we decided to merge those efforts into one coalition of coalitions that we're calling the HEAL Food Alliance, which stands for Health, Environment, Agriculture, and Labor Food Alliance. And it really, the goal of this alliance is really to transform the food system. It's not to reform pieces of it or to go at it one issue at a time, but to really look at it systemically and figure out how can we tackle the entire food system and turn it into something that works for all of us.
So HEAL is a coalition of coalitions, health,
Right.
environment, agriculture, labor.
Right.
What are your short-term goals? What do you think can happen in a positive way for laborers in the food system?
I think it's twofold, right? I think on the one hand, municipal codes right now are a path to some bettering wages and conditions for workers. One policy that we're testing is called the Good Food Purchasing Policy. And what it does is it frankly just puts the values that we all hold dear to our hearts in code, right, in the municipal code. So it has 5 value categories, right? Animal welfare, it has health, nutrition, labor, obviously, and both environment and local economies. And the goal of this is basically to create just some basic parameters around the food that we buy for our kids in school systems. So we're not buying just the cheapest possible food that we can find, food in quotes almost, right? Because the stuff that is fed to kids in public school systems, I have 2 children in the Chicago public school system, and I've seen the food that they feed them, and it's horrendous. It's not, it hardly qualifies as food. And so the idea really is to transform that and to turn it into something that is real food, that's good food, and that has these 5 value categories, and that labor is one of them. And the reason that is an innovation in and of itself is because if we're going to transform the food system, it's going to be not just the health of the food, the nutrition of the food itself, but it's going to be the entire food chain that needs to change, right? And so because of those reasons, we think that projects and policies like the Good Food Purchasing Policy are a path forward. The other path forward is to look at private corporations like Darden restaurants, for instance.
Jones, Olive Garden, Red Lobster, they spun off Red Lobster, but they're still Olive Garden.
Olive
right?
Garden, Yard House, Longhorn Steakhouse, they own about 5 or 6 brands. They're the largest sit-down restaurant corporation in the world. And the interesting thing about them is that they have a huge impact on the entire supply chain. So similar to Walmart, they often dictate the terms to the producers, right? They say, we need 40 tons of tomatoes, and this is how much we're going to pay you for them, and this is when we need them by, which obviously puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the producer, which oftentimes means that those producers are going to cut corners, and that oftentimes means paying less than minimum wage, or sometimes cutting the law, right? Completely violating the law. So to us, it's a combined effort of what can we do in the public sector, especially at the municipal level, and combined with what are some companies that we can actually move in the right direction, right? That have an impact, not just in that particular place, but that have a supply chain impact.
What kind of pressure are you trying to exert on
Darden?
Darden, for example? I mean, you're using them as an example. So what are you doing to make them move, as you say?
Yeah. So it's similar to what we're doing at the municipal level. We've convened a coalition of organizations that are targeting Darden, asking them to, by 2020, have 20% of their purchases be compliant with the Good Food Purchasing Policy value categories, right? Those 5 value categories that I outlined earlier. If they do that, it's going to mean not just a shift in better working conditions and wages for the restaurant workers of Darden, which in and of itself is significant, but it means a huge shift for the food chain workers that touch the products that are actually ending up in Darden restaurants.
Up and down the line, you're saying.
Correct.
And not just workers, but the food as well.
Food itself.
We've seen people be concerned about nutrition. We've seen people, consumers, eaters, be concerned about nutrition, about animal welfare, about, to some extent, about the environment, and finally, about labor. And I think that 5 years ago, when you started Food Chain Workers Alliance 5-6 years ago, people were not talking about workers in food systems. But there is more consciousness about that now. My feeling is that make food higher quality, to make it organic even, to set higher environmental standards for themselves, to be more concerned with nutrition and quality, but that at every one of those stages, what gets sacrificed is labor. And what, as you said, the image of the balloon, what gets outsourced, pushed off to the side, are workers. And that if workers in the United States were to be treated better, and even the worst paid workers in the United States are better off than many people around the world, Big Food is capable of just exporting those kinds of jobs. How do we see this as an international situation? How do we see this as a way in which those of us who are concerned about not only the quality of our food, but the way that it's produced, can have some sense that it's getting better internationally, that it's not just outsourcing misery, which is often what happens?
The bottom line, Mark, is that it's corporate greed, right? It's the cost of producing better food, organic food, or food without antibiotics, means that the cost is going to get offset to somewhere else in the chain. And I think, as you rightly are pointing out, right, oftentimes that means labor costs. I think there's a real need. This is why I am particularly obsessed with systems change work, right? Because it's not enough to just change the quality of the food or organize workers for better working conditions and wages, right? Because if you do that, you're squeezing in the opposite direction. It really has to be systemic. It really has to be the whole food system that we tackle in one piece, and it has to be transformational, because it's not going to be enough to just have a few better jobs here and a few better products coming out of another company over here, right? That's just not enough.
That's kind of where we are now.
That's exactly where we are. 90% of the food system continues to be the industrial food system. It's only upwards to 10%. It's maybe less than that.
Right.
That is good food. That's organic. That's all of that other stuff.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jose.
Oh yeah, thank you.
I'm Mark Bittman, and I've been speaking with Jose Oliva of the Food Chain Workers Alliance.